Sometimes a writer like myself has the best of intentions when we put together a fantasy story. However, sometimes the story elements don't work, the characterizations are a little off, the dialogue just isn't there, and the climax isn't satisfying. And what do we do when a story just doesn't work or is just a bad story? Well, us writers have to put a period at the end of it and move on. Now, this is an approach that I learned from Stan Lee many years ago when I was reading Origins of Marvel Comics, Son of Origins of Marvel Comics, and Bring On the Bad Guys. And those three books kind of taught me what you do when a story just doesn't work. And the reason why you have to put a period at the end of that story is because it's the only way you're going to grow in your craft as a writer. The longer you spend dwelling on mistakes, the less time you're going to have to work on improving your craft and developing your skills. Because the longer you spend dwelling on these old stories, you're not going to have any time to write brand new stories. And this was something I even learned in my own personal experience as a writer back in the 1990s when I was writing the first John Haynes story called The Changing Soul. Now, I spent a good 3 to 5 years working on this story, trying to improve it, trying to make it better. And this was my first novel, and I kept trying to make it, the best it could be. Unfortunately, the plot just didn't work, the dialogue didn't work, the characterizations were off, and there was nothing much I could do with this story. And eventually, I had to put a period at the end of it in 1999 and start working on the first ISIS book. And that was the best thing I ever could have done for my writing career because when I put the period at the end of that bad story, I was able to move forward and work with a character who I could write stories for. And from there, I was able to continue to develop my skills, learn a bit more about the craft of writing, and learn what worked and what didn't work. And from there, I learned how plot points worked, how character development worked, how dialogue worked, and I just got better as a writer. And what I see today a lot when it comes down to comics is that a lot of writers, when they have a bad story, they're not learning how to put a period at the end of the story. And I believe that's because the editors who work there really don't have an understanding of how to apply Stan's approach to comic book storytelling. They're still trying to fix things like a newbie writer like I was back in the 1990s in my 20s, thinking that if I eventually fix this story, eventually people will like it. And that's not the case at all. A bad story is a bad story, and once you publish a bad story, you just have to leave it out there. That's the only thing you can pretty much do with it because once something is published, there is no taking it back. Lucky for me, I never published The Changing Soul in spite of numerous submissions, and thank God that I didn't do it because that would have been a bad start for my writing career. ISIS was a much better start and a much better story. And over time, I have not written some bad ISIS. I haven't written great ISIS stories. There was a story that I wrote where I brought the East Team character back called The Politics of Hell. And that story um, introduced the Lucifer character and resurrected the East Team character from the death that she got from a spirit of the chest in the first ISIS. And that story was not the greatest. It was a little uneven. A lot of the plot points were a little off. The ideas were great, but the execution just was not there. And when I published it on Smashwords, it didn't get a really good reception, unfortunately. But that story pretty much was the foundation for Temptation of John Haynes. That was the foundation for this story. And this is one of the best stories that I have written. It's one of the most critically acclaimed books that I have written, and now that was taken from a bad story. And what I learned from the experience of that little short was to pick the story elements that do work from a bad story and apply them towards the foundation for a better story. Because sometimes the ideas are great in a story and they just need to be presented in a different way and they need to be executed in a different way. And that's something that a writer learns over time. That sometimes what you can do with a bad story is find those story points that do work and then apply those to a new story. And then, if they're executed properly, the reader may see the points that you're trying to make. Um, but that requires a writer to learn a bit more about story sense. And story sense, it gives you is an instinctive way of understanding what things work in a story and what don't, and that's something you learn over time. I learned story sense the hard way with just writing different stories and learning what paragraphs flowed into each other, what sentences flowed into each other, what dialogue told people about the characters and moved the story forward, what expository paragraphs describe the scene clearly to the reader, and that takes time for a writer to learn. And the only way you're going to learn that is through writing bad stories. Because with the bad stories, you learn what mistakes you're making, and then you learn why that doesn't work, and then you can apply that to new stories. Unfortunately, again, because a lot of people who do comics and fantasy these days, they don't have an editor who understands how these things work. There's nobody there to counsel them on how to build your stories, how to build good stories out of bad stories, and again, how to put that period at the end of that bad story so they can work us on this good story. A lot of times I see today in comics, the big problem is that a lot of writers spend time dwelling on the events of one bad story. And they keep trying to spend years trying to fix that element. If the longer you spend trying to fix those elements, the less time again you're going to have to focus on developing good stories. Because when you're writing stories, you have to be able to see them as individual components. And this is another big problem with comics today, is because everything is so tightly woven, you can't see a story as its own individual component with its own beginning and end. That was one of the things that I liked about the model that Stan Lee used. He usually applied an approach that said that each story had its own beginning, middle, and end, and then they made light references to those events in a previous story so that readers could see a timeline. But today, people are so caught up in continuity, they want to weave everything together, every little minutia moment, and make it like it's a tightly woven cloth. But when you have everything so interconnected and so tight, the stories can't be the individual components, and that makes it a lot harder for a writer to pretty much leave that bad story behind. Instead, what they have to do is try to find they try to spend most of their time fixing things, because one story is so interconnected with another that if you don't leave that story behind, it's going to make the whole structure fall through, the whole form fall through. And that's a big problem, because it shows that a lot of writers don't understand the two elements of structure and form. Now, the structure is the foundation of what the story is based on. That's your elements, like your main character, your what do they want, why should we care, answering those three questions. The form, however, to answer those questions is fluid, and that form can change in any way that the creator wants it to do if they understand how it works. And what I see with a lot of people is that they try to take the structure apart instead of working with the form. When I look at older writers and I look at their work, they usually, if something didn't work, they work with the form to get it right around the structure. Instead, these days I see people taking the structure apart with these reboots and these restarts, and you don't need to take the structure apart. The structure is fine. It's the form, and you have to take the form and make it work around the structure in a way that entertains and satisfies the reader. And when you understand how those two elements work, you can pretty much craft rock solid stories that satisfy readers for years, and they become classics because you understand the structures and the form, and you understand the techniques of storytelling that allow you to continue to craft really strong stories, generation after generation. And part of that run, when you're doing a run of stories, like I do with the ISIS series, you are going to have, bad stories. And if you understand structure and form, you can pretty much make those bad stories work for you in ways that appeal to the reader. You can make them actually go back to that bad story and see what the writer was trying to convey in that bad story. Like when I did recently in the ISIS series about a year or two ago with this Death of a Theta story. I was trying to um, show how the ISIS character left the Theta sorority that I introduced in the Thetas, and because they say that the character I wrote that the character died, her alias died in the 1970s in a car accident, and I wanted to show how that incident happened. And in that story, what happened was I show the twilight years of the Andrea Thomas Robinson character, Alias's days, and I show what leads up to the death of the founder of the Thetas, and it wasn't the best story I ever did. While my intentions were there, and I was trying to follow something that was inspired by the Superman animated series episode, The Late Mr. Kent, where Clark Kent is believed to be dead. The elements really didn't come together, but I managed to deal with that story, put a period at the end of it, and move on. And instead of me trying to fix that story, I just said it didn't work, but there were good elements here. So I'm just going to use those story points and then move on. And that's what you have to do in serialized storytelling, because that time you take to work on those bad stories is a time fixing that bad story. It's a time you could take to work on better ones. And I took the lessons that I learned from that Death of a Theta story that I did for the ISIS series, and I applied them to Imitation of Life this year. And what I wanted to do with these ISIS series stories that were flashbacks like Death of a Theta and Imitation of Life is I really wanted people to see what ISIS was doing in the 20th century, and because I didn't focus on that period too much, because the first ISIS book started in 1883, and wasn't able to focus on the timeline of the 20th century. By the time I brought East Team and ISIS over for the 21st century and the Temptation of John Haynes, the entire 20th century had passed, and I needed to talk about that in the timeline. So I wrote the Thetas to reintroduce ISIS to say what she was doing in that time. And then I wanted to fill that spot in. Unfortunately, the Death of a Theta story wasn't as strong as I thought it was, but the Imitation of Life story is much better. And I learned lessons from that as a writer. And that's what writers have to do when they have bad stories is dust themselves off and then continue persevering, because that next great story could be closer than they think, and all they have to do is go out and write it. That's all I have to say for this video. You can pick up many of the books that I discussed in this video on Smashwords for free, and you can see what a bad story looks like and then compare it to one of my better stories.